Right, well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be back for 2022. Welcome to our regulars and to any new people this week. Now, welcome also to those watching on Facebook. Now, we have actually changed our arrangement with J-Air this year, and instead of live streaming as we have been doing, J-Air is now going to replay the audio every Thursday at midday, live to air. That's on FM 88 in Melbourne, or everywhere else at j-air.com.au. There will also be a podcast available from the J-Air website so that anybody can access this at any time. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and also visible on your screens, David Adler, who is President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Melanie Phillips, who we will formally introduce in a moment. We're back to our usual format where we will chat with Melanie for about 35-40 minutes, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, we ask you to raise your hand electronically, and the way to do that is click the icon in the reaction button on the bottom of the screen. Now, we can also take written questions, and they can be put on the chat function, and watching that very closely is Robert Gregory, our Public Affairs Director, and he will read out some of these questions in between the spoken ones. Well, the moral decline of the West is becoming more and more evident, particularly in the United States and Europe, and here in Australia too, where the media and political elites seem to have forgotten how it took centuries of wars and struggles to achieve the free liberal lifestyle we now enjoy, and how it must be valued and protected rather than just thrown away under the misnomer of social justice. One person doing her bit and doing it very well is journalist, broadcaster and author Melanie Phillips, who is Britain's best known and most controversial champion of traditional values in the culture wars. Her books include the bestseller Londonistan, about the British establishment's capitalism to Islamist aggression, and that was followed by The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth and Power, published in 2010. Melanie has also written a novel published in 2018 titled The Legacy, which deals with conflicted Jewish identity, anti-Semitism and the power of history, along with her personal and political memoir, Guardian Angel. These days, Melanie is a prolific writer of articles that appear in all the online magazines that we subscribe to, as well as on her blog, which we will mention a little later. And we're delighted to have her with us tonight to discuss the decline of the West and how it may impact on Israel and on Jewish life around the world. Melanie Phillips, thank you so very much for joining us, and thank you for your time.
It's absolutely my pleasure and very good to be with you all.
Melanie, your blog article of only a few days ago started with Ukraine and then listed a whole range of events that illustrates the moral decline of the West over recent years. We'll get to specific issues soon, but when do you think this decline began and what triggered it?
How far back do you want to go? French Revolution? I would put the most significant date. Well, in fact, I would say there are two significant dates. One particularly as far as Britain is concerned. The one for Britain, I think you have to go back to the First World War, when the carnage in the trenches, which basically removed an entire generation of young men from Britain, made people think never again should we go to war. It introduced a note of defeatism and the whole really mindset of appeasement. Scroll forward to the Holocaust, the Second World War, and I think what happened then is the really crucial thing for the West, because the Holocaust occurred not in some benighted backwater of the globe. It occurred in the very epicenter of Western civilization and high culture, Germany, which thought itself to be the most advanced, the most cultured, the most wedded to reason. And everyone saw what happened was the antithesis of all that. And from that, I think, grew up a demoralization in the West, that if that could happen at the very epicenter of our culture, then something is rotten with our culture. And I think that demoralization created a kind of vulnerability among Western elites, particularly in Europe and in Britain, which then became very vulnerable to literally revolutionary ideas to do with the overturning of society, given impetus by the Holocaust on the basis that the West was rotten and corrupt and had to be overthrown. And the governing elite, certainly in Britain, were really unable to deal with this because they also thought that Britain and the West had really sort of had it morally, culturally, intellectually. And so scroll on, and the great journey through the institutions that took place when the revolutionary left realized that while it was impossible for the working class to rise up and seize the levers of economic and political power, nevertheless, the society could be overturned by undermining it from within. And so you had what was called the long march through the institutions, where the media, well, particularly the universities, the schools, the media, the churches, the professions, were all basically seeded with these ideas, which were basically anti-West, and ultimately, I would say also anti the Hebrew Bible and anti the Jewish people, but perhaps we can come on to that. So I see this as very much one thing that's happened. And what we're living through now is the latest iteration of this process, which has over the years become ever more extreme.
Yeah, and I just wonder whether it's a case of the pendulum swinging one way and it may eventually correct itself. What do you think? Do you think that's likely to happen or possibly can?
Well, pendulums do swing.
Yeah.
The problem is that they swing from one extreme to the other. They very rarely swing happily back to a kind of sensible center. And I think that's what we're living through at the moment. We're living through a great crisis in the West of democracy, a great crisis of trust, public trust in all the institutions of the state, a crisis of trust in the state itself, a crisis of belief and trust in the democratic process itself, because millions of people feel, and I think with a great deal of justification, that the entire political class in the West has basically abandoned them over the years, paying homage to ideologies which either ignore the real interests and desires of the Western public, or ride roughshod over them on the basis that they are in some way illegitimate, evil, racist, phobic, and all the rest of it. And as a result, people have been left rudderless, and into that kind of political vacuum comes people who represent the anger and the disappointment and the pain of the people who've been left abandoned by the political process, but who are themselves extreme in various ways. And so people, for want of a better, or for want of any alternative, turn to such people to rescue them from the situation. But it's a case of very often out of the frying pan into the fire. To mix my metaphor to do with pendulum swinging and frying pans and fires, I'm sorry about that, but anyway. So we are where we are. We haven't actually arrived at a situation yet where we have any clear idea of political leaders who represent what I believe millions of people understand viscerally, intuitively, emotionally, and intellectually to be the true center ground, to be the ground that stands for realism and truthfulness and integrity.
Yeah, let me just start with the recent attack on the Texas synagogue by a British jihadist that fortunately ended well, possibly due more to good luck than anything else. And although not directly involving Israel, it did involve the Jewish world. But the motives of the offender were initially covered up or sidelined before eventually being revealed. So let's start with the media. What does this tell you about the state of the media these days?
Well, the media reflected the inappropriate remarks by the FBI, which looked at the ostensible motive of the attacker to get a terrorist released, and concluded that had nothing to do with Jewish people. And so it was obviously ridiculous that he traveled all that way to take Jewish hostages in a synagogue on a Sabbath service, during a Shabbat service. And that had nothing to do with Jewish people, but you can see his train of thought, because there is a train of thought, and I think it's very pronounced in the West, in America, and certainly in Britain, that Islamic terrorism has nothing to do with Jews, except that they don't like Israel. The idea that, which I believe to be the case, that Islamic terrorism, Islamist extremism, is driven fundamentally by a hatred of Jewish people and Judaism, that it's the foundational ideologues of what we call Islamism, which is political Islam, the jihadi Islam, the idea that Islam must take over the world. Those ideologues were and are driven by the idea that they are in a terminal fight against modernity and the West, and that behind modernity and the West are the Jews. And so you don't understand Islamic terrorism and Islamism, political Islam, unless you understand the key role in this mindset of paranoia about the Jewish people. And so it was no surprise whatsoever to read subsequently that this guy who carried out this attack on the Texas synagogue was motivated by precisely this paranoid mindset. Nor was it a surprise, I have to say, to find that a number of people are now in the frame in Britain as a result of this attack, who are suspected of being part of the plot. And even if those people had nothing to do with this plot, it remains the case that the town from which this attacker came from is a town that is known by anyone who has followed this in any detail over the years as being an absolute hotbed of Islamist extremism. And the authorities know about this and have basically turned a blind eye. I'm sure the security service in Britain watches people in this town very carefully, but most people in Britain don't know about it. The media never reports it. And this really comes to the point that you were asking, and it touches upon the silence of the media over Islamic extremism in Britain, the extent that it has got to and what drives it is just forbidden territory for the media, because there is this tremendous pressure, which I'm sure you have in Australia, and it's certainly true in America and other countries in the West, that to talk about bad behavior or dangerous attitudes in the Islamic world is Islamophobic. And consequently, anyone who talks about Muslim anti-Semitism, as I do, is considered Islamophobic. Anyone who talks about Islamist extremism, as I do, is Islamophobic. And so you have a complete silencing of this very, very crucial discussion. And it goes very deep. It's penetrated into our political class, too frightened to speak about it. Many people don't even know about it because it's not explored to the extent that it should be, given the extent to which it has created such a terrible problem, particularly in Britain.
Mm-hmm. I'll hand over to David. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic as we progress. David?
Thank you, Melanie. I want to ask you a little about your principle of the decline of the West. Does it apply also within the Jewish community, organisations? If you can make some general observation about what you see as the trends in the Jewish community, and then I'll ask you a specific question.
Well, obviously, I know Britain's Jewish community best. That's where I come from. And I have looked in some detail at what's going on in America. I traveled there quite a lot, or I did before the pandemic, speaking to Jewish groups. I know rather less about Australia. I apologize for that. I know something about Australia and your very fine Jewish community. And so all these countries are different. The Jewish communities behave differently because the cultures of the societies are different. But I think that there is a terrible tendency in the Jewish world always to be on the back foot, to be defensive, to be frightened, to be timid, not to want to rock the boat, because there's always this feeling, and I think you have it less in Australia, but it's very pronounced in Britain, and I think it's also pronounced in America. It takes different forms, that the Jewish community is there on sufferance, and that it mustn't upset the mainstream view, because that is to promote or provoke anti-Semitism. And certainly in Britain, the Jewish community leadership does not speak out against Muslim anti-Semitism. On the contrary, I'm afraid it goes out of its way to show that it stands in solidarity with the entire Muslim world. Now, you know, if the Jews aren't standing up for one of the principal motors of current anti-Semitism, then sort of we're all lost. In America, you have a slightly different situation in which some 70%, I believe, of American Jews are what's called liberal. They vote for the Democratic Party. And they have broadly signed up to the very ideologies which, in my view, are being employed to destroy core Western values. And I believe have at their root an anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism perspective. And the tragedy of these American Jews is that they have persuaded themselves that these anti-Jewish ideologies somehow represent Jewish ethics, Jewish values. And this is a terrible confusion, and it has paralyzed them. And so I think the Jewish world is in a state of some denial. When you get below the leadership area, certainly in Britain, you find a much greater degree of realism. In Britain, there is a very great degree of unease in the Jewish community, and I think that's been the case. Well, I've certainly felt it to be the case. I would say since the terror campaign known as the Second Intifada broke out in the year 2000, and when Israelis of all kinds were being blown to smithereens in buses and pizza parlors and so on in Israel, Britain's cultural world, media and so on, turned against Israel for defending itself. And at that point, a number of people said openly to each other in the Jewish community in Britain, we have been living in a fool's paradise for 50 years. We have deluded ourselves that anti-Semitism is now a thing of the past, consigned only to the absolute fringes of society. And we didn't realize it was simply having a holiday. It went underground with the discovery of Auschwitz, and now the narrative has arrived which enables anti-Semitism to come roaring out of the closet, because the Israelis are being painted as Nazis, literally as Nazis. And at that point, as I said, several members of the Jewish community said to each other, it's over. But then it all settled down again, and a state of unease has remained. But people basically, again, you know, it's human nature, isn't it? You know, unless you are actually being personally targeted and your family has had personal experience of violence or extreme prejudice, you kind of tell yourself, well, things aren't too bad. And I think that's a very human tendency. But I think the evidence, you know, certainly in an area of London called Stamford Hill, which is an ultra-Orthodox area, in the last few days, there have been a number of violent attacks on Orthodox Jews in the street. And these have had virtually no media coverage, because I'm afraid attacks on Jews are somehow invisible.
Melanie, some of the dynamics you described certainly do apply in Australia, and those dynamics are actually what drove the formation of the Australian Jewish Organisation, Australian Jewish Association, to be principled. We do call out Islamic extremism and anti-Semitism, perhaps a little more vigorously than others, and we've also been labelled Islamophobes, even though we've had 4 Muslim guests on our events and work with a number of good Muslims. We had Hizb ut-Tahrir last year call for the necks of Jews. Some of the Israel advocacy issue I want to get your view on whether Jewish communities are taking a principled enough stand. We had a major BDS-driven event in Sydney over the last few weeks, organised boycott of the Sydney Festival, likely you've heard about it. A few years ago, AJA advocated for anti-BDS legislation in Australia, similar to that which exists in the US, to stop public funds going to organisations involved in BDS. And we were opposed by some major Jewish organisations in that initiative. So do you have any observations about Jewish community leadership and how they now undertake their Israel advocacy?
Well, I think the Jewish communities in Britain and America have themselves, to a greater or lesser extent, fallen victim to the very same process of kind of brainwashing in disinformation that has been applied to the rest of Western society. It's very difficult if you have a society which, like in Britain, you just don't see in mainstream media a fair account of what's going on in the Middle East today, how Israel behaves, which turns facts on their head. I mean, like in Israel's most recent incursion into Gaza, its campaign to eradicate to stop the missiles from coming over. The British media didn't report any of those thousands of missiles that had finally prompted Israel to act, and it represented Israel as an aggressor when in fact it was a defender, and it failed completely to say the truth, which was and is in virtually every conflict that Israel is involved in, that Israel's record in trying to protect the civilian lives of the people that are trying to kill it, to kill its Israeli citizens, its record in trying to protect civilian lives far exceeds the record of any other Western military, far exceeds it. And instead, Israel is presented as the rogue state of rogue states, which sets out to kill the innocent. Now, I feel subjected to all of that, even as a Jewish community, unless you have a very, very strong sense of your own Jewish identity and what it means in Jewish history, you are a victim to all of this and you kind of absorb all of this. Now, even those Jewish leaders, certainly, again, talking from the perspective of Britain, who are very much pro-Israel and understand that, Israel is defending itself and understand that lies are told and seek to combat those lies, I'm afraid that the Jewish world always takes the wrong position, and it's led in this by Israel, which does not help, because the Jewish world needs to understand that if you're defending a position from being on the back foot, you've lost the argument before you start, because you're arguing on the enemy's territory. And if the enemy is coming at you with grotesque lies, then it's no good saying, why are you being horrible to me? I'm the good guy. You have to actually turn the thing into a boomerang and turn it back onto them. So you have to put them on the back foot. So, for example, you have to actually proactively start educating people in the big lie that's being told. And unfortunately, a lot of Jews themselves don't understand it is a big lie. For example, one of the big lies is that the indigenous people of the land of Israel are the Palestinian Arabs, which were there since time immemorial. Now, historically, this is completely ludicrous, but no one knows the history of the Middle East, and Israel doesn't tell them. It doesn't bother to tell them for all kinds of reasons which we can discuss. And the Jewish community doesn't say this either. The Jewish community should be standing up and saying, not in the context of a war, but all the time, the indigenous people, the only extant surviving indigenous people of the land of Israel are the Jews, the only people for whom this was ever their national kingdom, centuries before even the creation of, even before Islam was even created. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, if I say that to people, they look at me as if I'm mad because they've never heard it before. Now, why haven't they heard it? because the Jewish community in the diaspora and in Israel never tells them. Why doesn't it tell them? Because the Jewish community itself in Britain very often doesn't know it, doesn't believe it, thinks that, you know, there are two peoples here who are both legitimately entitled to the land. They have absolutely no concept that this is historically and legally illiterate. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, you put people who are attacking you unfairly and grotesquely by these lies about, you know, Israel being the human rights offender and so on. You put them on the back foot. You don't say, look, Israel is actually the good guy. You put them on the back foot. You say, look at who you are supporting. This is what the Palestinians are saying to their own children, to their own people. Forget Hamas. This is what the Palestinian Authority is saying. They are using Nazi imagery and medieval anti-Semitic imagery to defame and present a paranoid view, not just of Israel, but of the Jewish people. This is what you're supporting. You are supporting profound, deep, traditional anti-Semitism. And you hold their feet to the fire all the time. So you take control of the narrative, which at the moment is being dictated entirely by people who are putting lies into the public mind, including the Jewish public mind. You take control of that narrative and you put into that narrative instead truth. But unfortunately, the Jewish world is simply saying, why are you being so horrible to us? We're the good guys, we're the victims. Look at all the wonderful things we're doing for the world. This cuts no ice at all. If people believe, as they do in Britain, that the people who are the rightful inheritors of the land are the Arabs, and the Jews, for whatever reason, basically got rid of them, and it's unfair and it's unjust, and they're still being unfair and unjust, then there is no contest.
Okay.
Yeah, Melanie, you'll be pleased to know, I think, that the AJA is one organisation that does scream this message from the rooftops, but you know, we get criticised for doing it, unfortunately. I'll go to some questions. Michael, we'll start with you. I do have a couple of sort of pre-requests. So Michael, if you're muted, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Melanie. It's a pleasure to hear your voice again. It's been a while since you've been in Melbourne.
True.
Yep. Unfortunately, the woke virus has hit the Jewish community in Australia, similar to the UK, with no vaccine in sight. But having said that, since your best-selling book, Londonistan, How Britain is Creating a Terror State Within a State, came out in 2006, the Muslim population of the UK has risen to nearly 3 million, whilst the Jewish population in UK has remained pretty stagnant at around 300,000 or just under. During this period of Muslim growth and the alliance with the socialist left, anti-Semitism has dramatically increased, much of it masked as anti-Israelism. Even when Israeli politicians urged British Jews to make Aliyah, they were vilified by a very weak Jewish leadership. So do you agree that the very passive Jewish population of the UK has, for the main part, been stuck in denial, and can this ever be reversed?
I'm not sure that the vast majority of British Jews are stuck in denial. I think that there are a lot of people in the Jewish community in Britain who are very much aware of what's going on, but for various reasons don't really have the means to do anything about it. Aliyah, for many people, is out of the question. I fully understand that. It's not an easy thing, to put it mildly, to uproot yourself and come and live in Israel. It's not for everybody, so that's one element. But certainly, as a sort of collective voice, it does not speak up in the way that it should. And you talk about now. I mean, one has to say, you know, what is so startling nowadays is that, frankly, you get a larger number of British Muslims who are saying what needs to be said about anti-Semitism and Israel and so on, then you get British Jews. They say it more clearly, because what has to be understood is that the Muslim situation in Britain is not a simple one. It cannot be characterized as it so often is in terms of black or white. In terms of, the community as a whole is a threat and so on. There are a very large number of British Muslims, mainly young, but not entirely young, but certainly among young British Muslims, who get it. And who are decent people, and they want to live as ordinary Brits, and sign up to, British values. And they speak courageously about the anti-Semitism in their community. They speak up, whereas British Jews are completely silent about this. And that's what I mean about, British Muslims taking an initiative which British Jews should be taking, and they're not. So there is a problem about denial. Will they ever wake up? I mean, frankly, I hope that they don't ever have to wake up, because that would probably entail some absolute catastrophe. But this isn't entirely a matter of personal perspective. Everybody has a kind of, I suppose, red line, at which point they say, at which point the difficulty or the danger of the status quo suddenly outweighs the difficulty and the danger of changing it. And for most British Jews, that equation is still, the status quo is livable with. They haven't reached that point yet.
Thanks, Melanie. Now, Hugh Kitson's normally in the UK, but he happens to be in Melbourne at the moment. And in fact, we had a very nice coffee this morning. So Hugh, it was nice to catch up with you, but you've got a question for Melanie, and then we'll go to a few others from the audience.
Hi, Melanie. It's good to see you again, and thank you very much for all the work that you do. Of course, you'll be very familiar with the old saying, evil prevails when good men do nothing. And that was certainly a factor that allowed this Shoah to happen. With our whole society crumbling under the pressure of woke ideology and cancel culture, and of course the psychological intimidation which goes with that, what can we as individual people do to preserve the Judeo-Christian heritage, which is really the building block of Western culture, as well as the nation of Israel?
Well, you ask a very important, but obviously very difficult question. I mean, what can individuals do to turn a culture around? The short answer is very little. I mean, what can any of us do as individuals? But we just have to make our voice heard whenever we can. We have to work out smarter ways of doing so. As I've mentioned before, I think that the position of the Jewish community of being on the back foot all the time is a pretty disastrous one. And I think that the community, the broader community, we're talking about, the broader pressures that are dissolving Western values. Again, people have to be more, much braver, and there has to be pressure on people to be braver. For example, I've been preoccupied with and been writing about recently what's called cancel culture, this terrible thing in which people find their books or their professional careers or their academic posts in jeopardy because of some notional offense they've given to some so-called victim group. Now, when you look at what's going on in the universities, in big companies, in all kinds of walks of life, where this is happening, it's not simply the students or the snowflakes or the woke brigade or however you call them, the people who are actually, signing their petitions, tearing down the statues, whatever they're doing. It's not simply that they are doing what they're doing, which is bad enough. It is that the people who are responsible for those institutions, the university principals, the publishing houses, and the people who run the big companies, they are actually going along with it. They're facilitating it, whereas they are in the position of responsibility for what's going on. they should be basically taking any condign action they take against the people who are trying to suppress free speech, who are intimidating and harassing and bullying others. Instead, they actually turn their guns upon the person who is being bullied and intimidated. Now, that's what's wrong. And that's where, I think public pressure, in the way that public pressure in a democracy operates, you make your voice heard in all kinds of ways. You express it in wherever you can. But that has to be, the people who are responsible for allowing this to happen and who are facilitating it, their feet have to be held to the fire by the public. The public has to find ways of making its disapproval known and putting some muscle behind it. It won't put up with this. It won't buy these products. It won't send its children to these institutions. It will speak up and identify correctly the appalling attitudes, not just of the people who are signing the petitions and doing the, trying to get the person banned, but the institutional authorities who are actually doing the banning. And I think that's what's missing at the moment. People are, everyone's got their own lives to lead, and, people who make a great fuss and jump up and down tend to be extreme, and that's why they jump up and down. And people who don't jump up and down tend to be, people of decent middle of the road views. But somehow those views have to be made known, and a robust objection to what's going on has to be registered.
Yes. Okay, so we'll go to some questions. I can see a few of our regulars have got their hands up, but if you don't mind, I might just ask some of the newer people to get their question in. But just before we do, I'll very quickly hand over to David to remind us what's coming up next week.
Okay, thank you, Alan. And very briefly, just two messages as usual. If there's anyone here who is not yet engaging with AJA, there are three things that we want you to do. You can go to the website and apply for membership or make a donation. The website is jewishassociation.org.au. You can also there on the homepage join our email list so that you're notified of future events and other information that we send out. And like and follow the Facebook page for up to date on often 2 or 3 times a day news and views. Now, next week, we have another female superstar, Carolyn Glick, who will be talking to us about the Jewish diaspora and what are some of the dynamics happening in the Jewish diaspora. I don't think Carolyn Glick needs a lot of introduction. She's based in Israel, one of the most prominent journalists, writes for the Jerusalem Post, and is often on television in Israel and the US.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we'll start off with, it looks like Anthony's screen, but I don't think that's Anthony. So please unmute yourself and ask your question. Anthony, that's it. Fire away.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Melanie. Lovely to have you. I recently read an article that both you and Richard Kemp wrote about the Mitrican Papers and how the state of Palestine and the Palestinian people is actually based on a spurious foundation that was fabricated by Russia for their own purposes. I was educated at a Jewish day school and I didn't know anything about that. So what I'm curious about is how come this huge lie hasn't been exposed and has been kept under wraps while we constantly hear the Palestinian chants about from the desert to the sea, river to the sea, blah, blah, blah.
Well, indeed. I mean, the short answer is that nobody will publish it. Nobody's interested. And there are very few platforms where one can actually write this kind of thing. I mean, I wrote about this, I've written about this on and off for some time. When Richard Kemp wrote his very fine article, which had some very spectacular quotes from people from the Soviet Union from the former Soviet Union about this plot. I wrote about it again. But I wrote about it, as I recall, I can either write about these things on my own blog, on my website, or I write about them for the Jewish News Syndicate, which I write for every week, which syndicates my work to Jewish outlets. But it goes no further than that, broadly speaking. It's very, very difficult to find platforms in the non-Jewish world which are prepared to print, publish, broadcast this kind of truth. It's just not known. As you say, you didn't know it. I know it. I've known it for some time because I follow these things closely and have, written about it. Again, it is, as you say, so fundamental that Palestinian identity is a fabrication, and that it was fabricated by the Soviet Union in cahoots with Yasser Arafat back in the 60s. And that involvement of the Soviet Union is precisely why we are in a situation which it's no cliche, it is a cliche, but it's no exaggeration to say it's Orwellian, because it is as if we're living inside a kind of Soviet propaganda machine in which truth and lies have been completely reversed as far as the Middle East is concerned, and the Jewish history of the Jewish people in the Middle East. I'm afraid so comprehensively has this taken over the mindset of the West that it's impossible to get this through. And this is, again, one of the quotes that Richard Kemp brought forward from one of these former Soviet apparatchiks who's now gone over to the other side, was that this was very much part of the West's, of the Soviet Union's broader agenda to subvert and undermine the West itself. It realized that the West was particularly vulnerable to the particular inversion of history in the Palestinian story. It realized why it was vulnerable. And it realized that that was a tremendous weapon for the Soviet Union itself to use to basically destabilize the whole of the West, to undermine its sense of truth and lies, and to knock the West completely off its moral compass, which has been achieved to the letter. And the result of that is that because it was Soviet disinformation, we don't know about it. It's only people who are presented as extreme, like myself, and presented as, fringe actors and therefore of no particular consequence, they can be written off, who just do not find the ability to get this through at all in mainstream culture.
Thank you. Yes, Miri, we'll take your question, and then Robert Adler, and then we'll go to the others.
Good evening, Melanie. I've been a long-standing ardent acolyte. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Some various social and political commentators of reason have suggested that the woke society is moving so extreme left of left at this point that it's liable at some stage to self-implode. And as Alan said, the pendulum may swing the other way. My question to you is, do you perhaps think in our lifetime the same thing could happen with the exponential rise of global anti-Semitism? And my second question is, what is your opinion on the current institutes of learning, like universities and various other institutions, which seem to be the cesspool of extremism and leftism and racism?
Well, these two things are connected. The late and great philosopher, British philosopher, Sir Roger Scruton, before he died, Roger Scruton was a tremendous, had a tremendous insight into totalitarianism. He had fought for many years underground, as it were, in the former Soviet Union for freedom of dissidents and so on. And he was a great philosopher and a great English conservative and English and British patriot. And he had come to the despairing conclusion before he died that the universities were beyond repair. And he drew a distinction between the science bits of the universities and the humanities. The humanities was where the problem was. The humanities were, as you say, a cesspool of falsehoods, and have basically turned the minds of generations into falsehood, and basically we're in the business now of suppressing reason itself. They were, in other words, they had turned into the antithesis of what a university should be for. And his despairing conclusion was that the university humanities department should simply be shut down, and that no further purpose could be served. And for somebody like him, who came from, you know, the liberal educational tradition, to reach such a conclusion, I think suggests precisely what you're implying, that they are beyond repair, and that the damage they do is incalculable. And you know, they basically they're basically the reason why it is broadly the educated classes in the West who subscribe to the lies about Israel. But when it comes to, you talk about, you know, whether the pendulum of anti-Semitism will turn, whether, you know, the extremes the extreme is such that the pendulum will turn. I mean, look, we all know, don't we, that anti-Semitism is the longest hatred. It is eternal. It will never go away. It is part of the human condition. We don't really know why. We can have all kinds of reasons and explanations. We can have long conversations about this, but ultimately it remains a mystery. But what we do know for certain is that it can never be expunged. It can only at best be kind of put back in its box, put under its stone. And now the question is whether that will happen. And I'm not sure that we've reached peak anti-Semitism yet at all, quite honestly. I think we have a long way to go down, a long way further to go down, because I think that the anti-Semitism epidemic that we're living through is intimately related to the demoralization in every sense of the West. And as long as the West continues to go down, anti-Semitism is going to go up. Anti-Semitism, as we know, comes roaring out of the closet in its unchained way when a society is going down, when a society feels that it no longer has a sense of itself which it can identify, it can be proud of, it knows what it is, it knows what it's for. And that's, I'm afraid, is what the West is going through. Now, whether the West will survive, whether the West will recover before it completely, you know, goes off the edge of the cliff, the cultural cliff, no one can say. But I do think these two things are intimately tied together. And so while the West is thrashing around in the difficulties that it is, I think that anti-Semitism is not only not going to go away, I'm afraid it's going to get worse.
Yes, okay, we'll take Robert Adler, so please unmute yourself, and then we'll take a written question from Robert Gregory.
Thank you. Melanie, you said we need to make our voice heard. And when I listen to the Muslim voice, I hear a very clear, strident message, usually a few spokesmen only. The rest of the community is quiet. When I listen to the Jewish voice, I wonder if there is one, because we are so diverse that we in a way, to me, it's a very fragmented voice. What I want to ask you is there a Jewish voice? I mean, I understand what most of us here wish for and want to broadcast, but is our problem, I mean, in my mind, the problem is that there is not an understanding within the Jewish community with an agreed or a consensus or some sort of agreement about a lot of these issues. And I mean at a fundamental level, and that the kind of woke tendencies now are affecting the Jewish community just as much as any other community. And that's an internal problem for us. It's you know, we can talk about the external and the threats there, but I worry more about a sort of internal fragmentation that we have. And I'm just wondering, when you use the word voice or our voice, you know, do we have one? Do we have when we say voice, do we have an agreed position that we can all say, well, all right, I'm part of that voice, and let's project that. Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, and it's extremely alarming. And if you look at Jewish history, you can see that what's undone us in the past is precisely this: that we turn on each other. We are the most argumentative and vociferous people on earth. You talk about the united Muslim voice or the strong and strident Muslim voice, and that is absolutely correct. And that's because it's done by fear. Muslims who don't agree with that voice, who have a different voice, are suppressed in fear of their lives. Now, Jews aren't going to do that ever. So, we are what we are. We are a deeply divided community, which will all argue with each other the whole time. And as you're absolutely right, that what we're talking about in terms of Western influences and the dissolution of the West and all that has affected the Jewish community as well. So there is no one Jewish voice. No, that is true. But those of us who are on, who share a particular view about what needs to be said, just have to be smarter and shrewder and more proactive and more strategic about how we make our voice heard and what we say, because we have to persuade people. There are many Jews who can be persuaded if the right arguments are used in the right way at the right time. It can get to them. I mean, we've heard already, there are people, part of your organization who didn't know certain things which should be known. For example, about, the fabrication of Palestinian identity. This is simply not known by people of great goodwill towards Israel and in the Jewish community, supporters of Israel. Now, if people on our side who sort of think like this were to start saying these things, and found ways in which we could actually, command public attention for them, then people's minds do change. Because if you're presenting facts, people haven't completely lost their wish to go down the path of, evidence and reason. They simply haven't got the information to make those sorts of decisions and judgments. I'm not for a moment saying it's easy. I think the point you make is a devastating one. It certainly is what's it undermines us, absolutely. But I think that those of us who think like me, I think many of you do, on this call, could actually be more effective in making our particular voice heard.
Thank you. Robert is our Public Affairs Director. Any written questions there that you want to ask, Robert?
Yeah, we've had a few. So just a question about your personal path, Melanie. What was the turning point that saw you having to get involved? And then a follow-up question, what do you see as the future for Jews in the West, in places like Britain and Australia?
Well, again, these two things are connected because around the year 2000, I concluded that I thought then the sort of scales fell finally from my eyes, as it were. And I came to the belief that, first of all, the Jewish community in Britain had no happy future and not one that I could share, in that I was no longer prepared to behave as I now saw the Jewish community behaving generally in Britain, which was either on its knees in supplication to the prevailing culture, or always looking over its shoulder in fear that that culture was going to rise up and bite it. And I was no longer prepared to live like that as a Jew. And I also came to believe, and this was, I'm encapsulating a very long process into a very short amount of words and time, but I came to believe that to be a proper Jew, I felt I had to be in Israel. That was where I could most completely realize my whole Jewish identity. That was a very personal decision. I wouldn't expect other people to make that decision. Everyone has different reactions to what's going on. But that was around the year 2000. And ever since, increasingly, I have been spending much more of my time in Israel. I now spend most of my time in Israel, but I'm still between two worlds. I shuttle back and forward the whole time between Israel and Britain. I'm still very committed to Britain. I'm very committed to Britain's survival. I believe that Britain has done wonderful things in the past, notwithstanding its terrible history towards Jewish people over many centuries. But nevertheless, I made that decision to kind of relocate my center of gravity away from Britain and into Israel. But this was the sort of second shoe that fell, as it were, in my own personal life, because I'd had early warning of this in 1982, when I was working for the Guardian newspaper, which you may know is like the New York Times, like Haaretz. It's the newspaper of the left in Britain. And I had a rude shock in 1982 when I suddenly realized that people on the left, who I thought were with me in fighting racial prejudice, in fighting oppression, in standing up for abuses of power, in protecting the vulnerable, I suddenly realized they were all on the other side, and they were basically anti-Jew and they were racist. And for various reasons, which I go through in my book, Guardian Angel, it took me quite a long time to put all this together. And as I say, the second shoe finally fell around the year 2000, when the reaction to the Intifada, which was vile, I mean, sheer anti-Semitism came pouring out of Britain in reaction to all these Israelis being blown to smithereens. And being accused to my face on mainstream British television that I had dual loyalties because I supported Israel at that stage. I think I'd visited Israel only once. I didn't come to Israel at all until the year 2000. All that persuaded me that I could, it changed my whole way of thinking about myself as a British Jew. Because I say that was an entirely personal decision. I wouldn't expect other people to go down that path.
Okay, we've got Rod. So Rod, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. I'm a bit bemused by your observations about the Palestinians and whether they're indigenous or not. You seem to be putting an either-or situation when it seems to me that, you know, obviously Jews are indigenous, but Palestinians have been in the area a long time. There's some situation we have to deal with. They're people, they've got their rights, and it seems to me we can't wish them away by talking about who's indigenous and who's not.
Well, I think the point about indigeneity is absolutely crucial, because I think with respect, what you've just said portrays a great deal of confusion. Palestinians are not indigenous. The people who were called Palestinians until the state of Israel was created were the Jews. Palestine, as you I'm sure know, was a name that was imposed upon the area by the Romans as an insult to the Jews and as an attempt to wipe out the fact that it was a Jewish place. It was Judea. The idea of Palestinianism, the idea that the Palestinians were there first is ludicrous. When you say there were lots of Palestinians there the whole time, or when the Jews arrived, that's not true. There were Arabs there. The majority were Arabs, that's true. But they were Arabs who, by their own lights, if you have to read what they were all saying at the time, they consider themselves as Arabs, part of the Arab nation. They consider themselves as anything in the early years of late teens, early 20s of the last century. They called themselves Southern Syrians and so on. Now, what then happened was, because the Jews were coming back, because of the international community saying they should be coming back because it is their ancestral homeland, they alone have the right to come back because they alone had this as their ancestral homeland. What happened was that on the back of the returning Jews, who were perceived correctly to bringing with them prosperity and jobs and so on, a lot of Arabs came in from neighboring lands, and not just Arabs. I forget how many nationalities were calculated at the time, but it was something like 40 or 50 languages being spoken. You know, it's a very recent history. In terms of who actually was there at the time. You can't say there are many people there. Of course, there are many people there, many people who are Arabs there. Yes, that's true. But they didn't identify as an entity called Palestinians until the 1960s, when it was invented as an artifice. Now, it's not just me saying that. I can send you, if you like, quotes from various Arabs at various times, including people from the PLO in recent years, saying in terms, there is no such thing as Palestinian national identity. We invented it to eradicate the Jewish presence in the land. They have said that over and over again. So since it is absolutely a mainstream part of the animus against Israel, that the people who are entitled to the land are the people who are indigenous to it, the people who were the original inhabitants, the people who originally owned it, who originally had their identity formed by it. Since that myth, and it is a myth, it is a fiction, is the fundamental motor of anti-Israelism, and I believe a lot of anti-Semitism of the more traditional kind that's erupted, then I think it's absolutely crucial to make these distinctions and to say that, you know, let's start from the position of truthfulness, that, you know, there is only one people to whom this land was ever their national kingdom. There is only one people for who have legal and any legal and historical rights to that land. It doesn't mean that one shouldn't try to find an accommodation of some kind with the Arab world. On the contrary, but you don't get anywhere if you are interested in peace and justice. You cannot have peace and justice on the basis of a lie. And the idea of Palestinian indigeneity is a lie.
Thank you. Now we are coming up to time. Danny, we'll take your question and then we'll see how we go. Please unmute yourself.
Actually, it was an accident of my machine that I put my hand up, but I just want to say that Melanie's been outstanding as always, and her writing is outstanding too, and she's most courageous. Melanie, if I'm asked to put a question, people constantly refer to people who I think are on our side, talk about Palestinians. How do you describe those people?
Sorry, how do I describe which people?
The people called Palestinians. How do you describe them in your writing?
Yes, well, I try whenever possible to call them Palestinian Arabs because that seems to me the most neutral way of describing them. If I describe them simply as Arabs, well, that's very unhelpful because they are not just Arabs. They are Arabs who make a claim that has to be acknowledged in terms of factual. That's the claim that they make. To call them Palestinians is simply to go along with the fiction. Sometimes I put it in quote marks. Sometimes I call them Palestinian Arabs. But I'm afraid the requirements of journalism, and particularly headlines, and the need to make everything as short as possible, and to convey quite complicated ideas in as few words as possible, which is the discipline that we journalists, I'm afraid, have to labour under. Means that it's not always possible to do all these things, and it just looks sometimes ridiculous, and it sort of gets in the way. So sometimes I call them Palestinians because it's in the context of this is the discussion that's going on. So I don't really have a view, but I suppose my most neutral term would be Palestinian Arabs. Because they identify as Palestinians, but they are actually Arabs, and the Palestinians were always the Jews. So I would say Palestinian Arabs, because in fact, if you go back to before the state of Israel, you could say they were Palestinian Arabs because they lived in a place which, for administrative convenience, was called Palestine, even though it had no salience beyond an administrative name. It's not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but it's not a very satisfactory situation.
No, exactly. Now, I think I saw Peter Baum with his hand up. If so, please unmute yourself, Peter. And if not, we might just go back to David for a moment and then come back to Peter if he's there. David?
Okay, well, firstly, I just want to say two things. One is that the AJA habit is to refer to Arab Palestinians, or if we have to make it shorter, we use the term Palestinians in inverted commas. And I guess that invites a question. And if anybody asks a question as to why we've put it in inverted commas, it gives us an opportunity to elaborate. But there's been a general theme tonight about the importance of having a voice to articulate some of these principles. And I don't think that we're there entirely yet, but there is a lot of effort that is going into developing AJA along those lines into being a principled voice for the Jewish community. And one thing that we've seen is the way our community has reacted. And it is clear and very easy for people to react on social media. They vote with their clicks, and AJA has become by far the largest Jewish voice in Australia on social media across a number of platforms. So I think that says something. I don't pretend that it's a solution. I don't pretend that we haven't got a lot more improvement to make, but I would hope that some of the people here, and indeed Melanie, might take some positivity that there is a real effort to have a clear and principled voice, at least developing in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Melanie, look, everybody, we do have to wrap it up. I'm sorry to the regulars, but we won't forget you next week. Melanie, our audience will be all very familiar with your great work, and we're just so grateful that you are articulating the common sense so well that seems to be missing from much of the public discourse. Now, people will know that they've seen your articles all over the online news outlets, but I'm going to take the opportunity to endorse your premium subscription in order to get a whole lot more of you. For us in Australia, it's about $8 a month on an annual subscription. So tell us, how and where do people find you in order to join up to your subscription service?
Well, that's very kind. May I just say what a pleasure it's been to speak to you all and to hear about the work that your organisation is doing. I do think, I may be naive, but I do think that truth drives out lies. I think that from what I've learned from my experience is that one should try and ignore the noise from social media, Twitter and all that, and even the mainstream media, and realise, as I've come to realise over many years, that out there are millions of decent, ordinary, sensible people who are listening carefully. And if one can find a platform which you are creating, then you can do a great deal of good. So my own little effort in this regard is my website. You can find it at melaniephillips.substack.com, melaniephillips.substack.com, and on that you will find my blogs, which I write simply for the website. Some of those blogs you can have a premium subscription, which means that if you pay a small amount of money, which you kindly referred to, you will get material designed only for those people who pay. But everyone who subscribes gets everything, which includes everyone who subscribes gets everything that is sent to my whole list, which includes not only my designated blog pieces, but also my regular columns for the Jewish News Syndicate, and links to my broadcasting outlets as well. So I hope you all join up one way or the other.
Thank you, Melanie. Yes, thank you again. Please don't stop doing what you're doing. It's been a pleasure to have you join us. Just before we go, the L'Chaim Summer Series with Morris Klein is on now, 3ZZZ FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Join us next week for another superstar of the Israel advocacy world in Caroline Glick. Don't forget that you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page, so we ask you to please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. So from me and everybody else, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.